In 1947, California became the first state within the United States to maintain a sex offender registry. Individuals convicted of sex offenses were required to provide law enforcement authorities with their place of residence and to check in annually around their birthdays. California officials passed this law in order to enhance public safety and prevent recidivism. Nevertheless, former sex offenders were afforded a high level of anonymity and they could more or less live their lives without harassment or scrutiny from their neighbors. This is probably because the rehabilitation model was popular in American penology during this time. Also, there would soon be unprecedented amounts of governmental assistance, including educational subsidies and extremely low-interest housing loans subsidized by the federal government. Additionally, the federal government would begin spending billions upon billions of dollars on public transportation, sewage systems, parks, as well as other projects. Also, during this time, incarceration was used only as a last resort. There were no more than 117 convicts per 100,000 residents in the United States. Also, the American prison population would continue to decline by about 1% per year. And by 1970, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, there were only about 96 convicts per 100,000 residents. Beginning in 1973, the American imprisonment rate would rapidly escalate, giving the United States the dubious distinction of incarcerating over 25% of the world's prisoners, despite comprising only 5% of the world population. Today, criminal justice officials employ a variety of technological gadgets, such as electronic energy devices, computerized mapping of offenses, satellite-aided electronic monitoring, and genetic fingerprinting to manage and to control those deemed to be dangerous. Computerized sex offender databases, which are accessible by the general public, reflect the United States shift from rehabilitating individuals to managing and surveilling a subclass of society. Today, Americans have become obsessed with punishment, and they're not afraid to spend an incredible amount of tax money to subdue individuals deemed to be dangerous. Presently, America's criminal justice juggernaut consumes more than $200 billion a year, with the carceral function constituting over one-third of the total price tag. As the United States has downsized social welfare programs, it has supersized its criminal justice system, and convicted sex offenders have become the privileged targets. If you have read the articles for this week, you know that the passage of statutes such as the Jacob Wetterling Act, Megan's Law, and the Adam Walsh Act require law enforcement officials to upload the names and photographs of sex offenders into centralized public registries. Also, as you probably know from the readings, a registrant's current housing location, place of employment, and offense information is typically included in these databases. The passage of the most recent piece of federal legislation, the Adam Walsh Act of 2006, requires all 50 states to maintain publicly accessible internet sites where sex offender registration is available. Under this act, states that do not maintain sex offender registries automatically face a 10% reduction in their Bureau of Justice Assistance grant. For this week, you will read a number of articles, including an article titled A Qualitative Assessment of Registered Female Sex Offenders. This is an article that I co-authored with Professor Donna Van Diver of Texas State University and the late Dr. Kelly Cheeseman. In this study, we specifically focused on female offenders. One of the major findings of this paper is that female sex offender registrants in both the state of Illinois and Texas are being forced to attend treatment with male sex offenders. I have done subsequent research since the publication of this work and have found that this practice is still continuing, at least within the state of Texas. As you reflect upon the readings for this week, ask yourself whether or not you feel as though this is conducive to a sex offender's rehabilitation. Given that individuals who are in sex offender treatment programs are required to discuss the nature of their crimes, which are often highly personal, does it make sense for these programs to be co-ed in nature? Some might argue that this is highly problematic. What do you think? And also, why do you suppose that some states, such as Texas, still persist in doing this? Over the last few years, I have spent a fair amount of time researching sex offender registries. In one of my more recent projects, I conducted in-depth interviews with 24 registered sex offenders across 7 counties in East Texas. The interviews were all conducted in the subject's home. While this may appear to be a very small sample, this study was not meant to provide generalizations about all registered sex offenders. Instead, it was an exploratory study designed to generate different types of hypotheses and provide a baseline of information about a very small population. While working on this study, I was very concerned with respecting the rights of each potential participant, and I did not want the subjects to feel compelled to participate at any time. In order to provide appropriate safeguards for the respondents, this project went through a full human subjects review. Each participant was told that they would be granted complete confidentiality, provided that the interview did not generate new reports of child physical or sexual abuse. Also, respondents were informed that confidentiality would be broken if they indicated an intent to harm either themselves or other people. Obviously, I was not going to do anything which might give me guilty knowledge about any type of a crime that might occur. And if I was to have come across a new report of child physical or sexual abuse, which I did not, this would have made me a mandated reporter, which means by law I would have felt compelled to break confidentiality with the research subjects, and morally this is something I would have definitely done anyway. One of the major findings of my study is that the overwhelming majority of respondents that I interviewed reported that they had experienced significant levels of harassment as a result of having been publicly identified as sex offenders. From conducting these interviews, I believe it is plausible that sex offender registration statutes, such as the most recent Adam Walsh Act, separate sex offenders from mainstream society. I found that the information available on internet-based registries is often extremely limited and provides very little meaningful and helpful data to the public. The definition of what constitutes a sex offense in the United States is also overly broad. For example, some jurisdictions within the U.S. consider acts such as public urination, prostitution, adult-on-adult incest, streaking, and consensual sex between teenagers as offenses which may warrant mandatory registration. While the above behaviors may certainly offend our sensibilities, they may not necessarily warrant a lifetime registration as a sex offender. Also, the sparse information contained on sex offender registries is often confusing and may give the public a false sense of security. In this respect, sex offender registries are particularly problematic as they may actually lower parental vigilance in monitoring the child's contacts with family members and friends who are statistically much more likely to offend against children. In other words, this false sense of security may actually lead to more child victimizations. This means that it is possible that the sex offender registry is doing more harm than good. It is worth noting that many scholars do disagree with this, but nevertheless, at the very least, I believe that this issue is worthy of our attention and more research should be conducted in this area. Despite the fact that sex offender registries may be problematic, courts have upheld the constitutionality of these registries, in spite of the fact that they probably do create a social stigma which may lead to feelings of shame and helplessness. While some people might feel as though sex offenders should be publicly shamed and publicly embarrassed, I would submit to you that this might actually lead to more victimizations. The reason for this is that there is some research in the sex offender field that suggests that feelings of guilt and shame may paradoxically increase sexually acting out. If this is true, then policymakers really need to consider what they intend to accomplish by using these registries. Policymakers must first and foremost consider what can be done in order to make society a safer place, especially for our children. So read over all 3 of the articles for this week, and as you do, consider whether or not sex offender registration statutes ultimately hinder offenders from reintegrating back into their communities. The U.S. is currently the nation which has the most draconian form of public sex offender registration statutes, but I predict that these laws have the potential to flourish in other countries. Over the past decade, several industrialized democratic nations have begun to employ some variation of sex offender notification statutes. The United Kingdom instituted notification procedures in 1997 with the passage of the Sex Offenders Act. It is noteworthy that this was done shortly after the United States passed the Jacob Wetterling Act and Megan's Law. In 2000, New South Wales was the first state within Australia to pass a sex offender notification law. Interestingly, this statute, known as the Child Protection Act, was modeled after the United Kingdom statute. By 2005, all 8 regions within Australia would have sex offender notification statutes, as well as the web-based Australian National Child Offender Register, spanning across the entire continent. Countries such as Canada and the Republic of Ireland have also instituted sex offender notification statutes within the last 10 years. While some nations have passed sex offender notification statutes, to date, the United States is the only country which makes the names, photographs, addresses, and workplaces of sex offenders known to the general public. Internet-based sex offender registries, which are accessible to the public, could very well provide a false sense of security and possibly lead to retaliation against individuals who are listed on the registry. In this respect, technology may actually facilitate rather than prevent crime. Also, I want you to consider one more thing. It is possible that the stigmatization of sex offenders could lead to sex offenders being concentrated in poor neighborhoods where there are presumably higher numbers of at-risk children. Individuals who are put on the registry are often forced out of their middle-class communities and they're displaced to poor communities. This means that stigmatization will ultimately lead to a high concentration of sex offenders being in poor neighborhoods. This is particularly problematic because it means one would presume that these policies are going to have large numbers of at-risk children in poor neighborhoods. They're already at risk and vulnerable, and they're going to live in close proximity to more and more convicted sex offenders because the sex offenders are being forced out of the middle class communities and into the poor communities. And to me, this is very, very problematic. We know that the poor communities are not going to have a lot of the mechanisms to protect them the way middle class communities would have these mechanisms, like cameras, more patrol cars, and so forth. And so I think it's really worthy of further investigation and examination. By way of conclusion, I would like to say that I am not advocating the outright elimination of sex offenders, of sex offender registries, I should say. But I am suggesting that it might be prudent for policymakers to at least consider that these statutes may actually lead to more victimization. Given all that is at stake, there needs to be much more research in this area. Please contact me if you'd like a copy of the article or the references for this presentation, as well as any additional information related to the recent scholarly work or other scholarly works in this area. Thank you.